Charles Spencer just revealed a document that rewrites 30 years of royal history. The most important part is not just what the letter says, but the fact that Princess Anne kept it secret for 3 decades while everyone else was selling their version of Diana to the media. This is not just about a lost letter. It is about a hidden alliance that completely contradicts the story we were told about Diana and Anne hating each other. When you look at what was actually written versus what happened, the whole thing feels less like a discovery and more like a deliberate undoing of the palace's carefully built mythology. The scene at Althorp House is almost too cinematic to be real. Charles Spencer is sitting at a heavy walnut desk in the library, morning light coming through massive windows. He has an antique mahogany box in front of him. He is wearing white cotton archivist gloves, which already tells you he is treating this like a historical artifact and not just family mail. The box has a brass handle, an iron lock from the late 19th century, and it had been sitting in a secure vault under the mansion. He unlocks it with a small ornate key. Inside, resting on faded blue silk, is a single sheet of light blue writing paper. The date at the top right corner reads August 10th, 1997. That is 21 days before Paris. The handwriting, the crest, the embossed Kensington Palace initials, all of it says this is Diana writing directly to Princess Anne. Not a draft, not a diary entry, a formal letter addressed to her sister-in-law. For nearly 30 years, the official line from royal biographers and the press was that Diana and Anne were basically incompatible. Diana was the emotional, high-fashion, media-savvy one. Anne was the no-nonsense, country-focused, traditional one. The media pushed this rivalry angle constantly. They said Anne thought Diana was shallow and obsessed with publicity. They said the two women avoided each other behind closed doors. But this letter completely destroys that story because what it shows is that during the darkest period of her separation, Diana was not turning to her glamorous friends or her celebrity circle. She was turning to the one person in the royal family who she believed had the courage to stand up to the palace machine, and that was Anne. The physical details of the letter matter more than people realize. Charles Spencer had spent 48 hours working with a forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives before he said anything publicly. They compared the ink pressure, the inconsistencies in the handwriting, the signature against hundreds of verified letters in the Spencer family repository. The verdict was absolute. This was authentic, and the way it was delivered is just as important as the content. Diana did not use the standard royal mail system at Kensington Palace. She knew that was being monitored. Instead, she had her most trusted chauffeur drive the envelope directly to the equestrian stables at Gatcombe Park, where he handed it to Princess Anne's head groom under strict confidentiality. That is not a casual note between sisters-in-law. That is an operation. And it tells you exactly how paranoid Diana was about the palace intercepting her correspondence. When you read what she actually wrote, that paranoia makes complete sense. The letter does not open with pleasantries or formal titles. Diana addresses Anne simply as Anne, and the tone is intimate, vulnerable, and urgent. She writes about her growing fear that the senior courtiers managing her son's public profiles were creating a rigid institutional environment that would damage their emotional development. She says she felt an urgent need to build a permanent, independent protective barrier around William and Harry, and she believed Anne was the only member of the Windsor household with the raw courage to stand against the palace bureaucracy. That is not a vague concern. That is a mother identifying exactly who she trusts and why. The palace's reaction to this disclosure is where things get even more suspicious. Charles Spencer had his legal team deliver a high-resolution photocopy to Clarence House on Wednesday afternoon before the public announcement. He gave them a courtesy window to review it. And what happened? The palace legal department spent the entire night scrambling through the 1993 Royal Trust Acts, trying to find some statutory grounds to block publication. They wanted an injunction. But here's the thing, they could not do it because the letter was found in the private archives of Althorp House, addressed to a private individual, not a state official. It fell outside the Official Secrets Act and outside the Royal Collection Trust jurisdiction. The Crown had zero constitutional authority to suppress it, so the King's advisors were forced to just sit there and watch as the breaking news alerts went out. And that tells you everything about how desperate they were to keep this quiet. Now let us talk about the secret communication network between Diana and Anne, because this is where the story really deepens. The letter was not a one-off. According to the details emerging from Gatcombe Park, there had been a confidential system operating between the two women for over 18 months. While the national newspapers were publishing stories about their supposed rivalry, the palace administrative archives show something completely different. Between 1996 and 1997, Anne's charitable schedules frequently placed her in the same regional sectors as Diana's private humanitarian visits. On 3 distinct dates, their cars were logged at identical service depots near the M4 motorway within 30 minutes of each other. The palace tried to frame these as coincidences, but when you look at the timing and the locations, it is pretty clear these were coordinated private briefings. Anne was providing Diana with tactical updates on the legal strategies being formulated by the king's solicitors in London. There is a specific incident from the summer of 1996 that backs this up. During a private family dinner at Balmoral, a senior advisor to the Queen suggested using ancient Crown property statutes to restrict Diana's access to her apartments at Kensington Palace. The plan was to force her administrative office to a secondary site outside the capital, effectively reducing her media presence. Anne interrupted the presentation immediately. She called it an act of absolute corporate stupidity that would permanently damage the Crown's public standing, and she killed the proposal before it could even be drafted into an official warrant. Diana learned about the confrontation the next morning through a secure phone link provided by Anne's lady-in-waiting. So this was not just a friendly relationship. This was an active protective alliance operating behind the palace's back. The letter itself contains a chilling predictive assessment that has stunned modern royal biographers. Diana wrote that she had discovered a confidential plan by senior court officials to systematically reduce her personal protection detail using security arrangements as a pressure tactic to get her to surrender her independent media operations. She used the phrase administrative trap to describe the legal mechanisms being prepared, and she explained that the ultimate goal was to use an ancient clause within the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a private custody dispute asserting the sovereign's overriding prerogative to control the education, residence, and daily movements of her sons. That is not a paranoid fantasy. That is a specific legal strategy being described by someone who clearly had access to inside information. Then she turns to the emotional core of why she is writing. She says her deepest fear was not losing her public standing or her travel logistics. It was the cold, institutional environment that would consume her boys if she were suddenly removed from their daily upbringing. She describes the senior advisors as a corporate board of directors who viewed the young princes as functional pieces of state machinery rather than developing human beings who need genuine parental affection. Those are the words of someone who understood exactly what she was fighting against. And she was begging Anne to be the unyielding emotional barrier between her sons and the traditionalists who wanted to shape them into distant, unfeeling symbols of the state. The physical evidence of how much effort Diana put into this letter is striking. The archivist's gloves worn by Charles Spencer revealed multiple corrections on the reverse side of the page. Diana had scratched out initial sentences and replaced them with more precise, legally binding language. She was not just venting. She was crafting a document that could hold up in court if it was ever retrieved during a family crisis. She wanted to make sure palace attorneys could not dismiss it as an emotional outburst. It was designed to be irrefutable evidence of the pressure she faced. In the middle of the second page, Diana references a secret personal repository containing over 200 original letters and diary entries from her school days and early marriage. She wrote that she had hidden this archive outside the palace infrastructure entirely, separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle, and she instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever attempted to completely block her access to her sons. That clause has triggered immediate panic inside Buckingham Palace because if those letters are still sitting in an anonymous vault somewhere, the Crown faces a permanent threat of historical exposure. The King's legal teams are reportedly working through the night to track the movement of all Spencer family holdings from that era, trying to locate the vault before anything else leaks. Then there is the postscript. Diana added a short, devastating final line just before sealing the envelope. She wrote that she was leaving for the Mediterranean the following morning with a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that her time to secure her son's emotional safety was rapidly running out. That line, written 3 weeks before her death, transforms the entire document from a piece of family correspondence into a haunting historical testament. It is the voice of a woman who knew she was running out of time. Now the question everyone keeps asking is why Princess Anne kept this secret for 30 years. And the answer, when you look at her track record, is actually pretty consistent with who she is. Anne has spent her entire adult life operating as the foundational pillar of the Crown's traditional infrastructure. Her primary allegiance is not to public relations campaigns or media cycles. It is to the long-term continuity of the state. She understood that revealing a letter alleging an administrative conspiracy inside the palace would have triggered a massive constitutional crisis during the delicate transition period of the late 1990s. The public fury would have derailed the stabilization of the monarchy and directly threatened the future reign of her nephew, Prince William. So she made a deliberate choice to absorb the emotional burden in total isolation. While the tabloids were portraying her as cold and distant, Anne was quietly executing the protective role Diana had begged her to assume. The official court circular logs show that between 1997 and 2005, Anne adjusted her charity calendars to ensure she was consistently present at Windsor during the boys' academic breaks. She did not bring cameras. She did not invite royal correspondents. She just arrived in her private car, walked with William and Harry through the quiet pathways of the great park, and gave them a stable, down-to-earth space, completely insulated from the frantic public relations maneuvering at Clarence House. She became the emotional barrier Diana had prayed for without ever demanding public validation. That silence held for 3 decades, and it almost broke in 2026 when the palace archivists began preparing for a major national milestone celebration. The master of the household requested a comprehensive audit of all private correspondence files held at Gatcombe Park. They wanted to transfer any sensitive historical documents to the official central repository at Windsor Castle, where they could be vetted and restricted under the 50-year rule. Anne rejected the audit instantly. She told the central registry clerks that her private safe contained personal family correspondence entirely separate from the state's administrative workflow, and she refused to hand over the keys. That refusal created an immediate tactical bottleneck because the palace legal department realized they had 0 statutory grounds to force a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to surrender her private papers without creating a highly damaging internal court battle. The resolution came on Thursday morning just hours before Charles Spencer made his announcement. He traveled to Gloucester by private car for an urgent briefing with Anne. He told her his legal team had independently verified the original manuscript found at Althorpe, and he believed the public interest required immediate publication to correct the false historical narrative. Anne listened in complete silence, and then she realized that with the alpha copy fully verified by forensic experts, any further attempts to hide the duplicate would look like a desperate palace cover-up, so she gave her quiet formal endorsement to proceed. She chose to let the truth emerge naturally through the historical archives rather than engaging in a defensive public relations campaign. The safe at Gatcombe Park was finally opened later that afternoon, and the duplicate copy was cross-referenced against the original one final time. The handwriting matched, the ink pressure matched. The faded black rollerball lines were identical. The shockwaves hit Buckingham Palace at exactly 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. The emergency server logs registered an unprecedented spike in internal data traffic. Over 300 administrative computers within the palace network were simultaneously accessing the high-resolution scans uploaded from Althorpe. The standard workflow of scheduling diplomatic visits and drafting minor press releases stopped completely. Senior media directors crowded around the primary monitoring wall watching BBC News and Sky News correspondents standing outside the palace gates holding early print editions of the newspapers. The front pages featured large black typography analyzing the exact phrase administrative trap that Diana had penned 33 years earlier. The impact on the palace's carefully constructed historical image was immediate. For years, the public relations machinery had worked to frame the royal friction of the 1990s as a simple tragic breakdown of a private marriage. They spent millions from the sovereign grant to project an image of modern streamlined continuity. But the revelation of a hidden alliance between Diana and Anne dismantles that corporate narrative entirely. It proves that the deepest trust within the court belonged to the traditional guard, not the central hierarchy. Public opinion polls showed over 80% of respondents praising Anne for carrying the emotional burden in silence, while the perception of the old administrative guard plummeted. The communications team had been scheduled to launch a major media campaign on Friday morning to promote Queen Camilla's upcoming state charity appearances. After the viral explosion of the Althorpe letter, the media directors realized that proceeding with fashion and lifestyle updates would look incredibly tone-deaf to a public reading about a mother's final desperate warning. The King's chief secretary froze the entire promotional schedule, locking the media assets back inside the main archive safe until the cultural storm stabilized. The internal family fallout resolved itself at noon. A secure communications link was established between the King's study at Clarence House and Prince William's private office at Adelaide Cottage. The King's advisors wanted to draft a joint defensive family statement that would acknowledge the historical value of the letter while gently framing it as a reflection of a bygone era. They wanted William to sign his name to a text claiming the family had long since moved past the administrative conflicts of 1997. William rejected the palace script completely during the 20-minute call. He informed his father's private secretary that he would not authorize his staff to participate in any public relations campaign designed to minimize or spin his mother's original words. He said the handwritten note was an authentic piece of his own family history, and he fully respected the absolute non-disclosure that his aunt had maintained for 30 years to protect his childhood education. By refusing to back the central administration's defensive strategy, William effectively isolated the King's advisors and left them exposed to the full force of public scrutiny. The final administrative verification was stamped into the database at the London High Court Probate Registry on Friday afternoon. The original 1997 light blue Kensington Palace paper is now permanently registered in the public archives of the state. The physical manuscript was placed in a secure, temperature-controlled archival box, ensuring Diana's authentic voice is locked away from any future attempts at palace censorship. Outside the palace gates, thousands of people stood in silence holding evening editions of the newspapers that featured full-page replicas of the sloping handwriting. Over 90% of respondents in public polls expressed deep gratitude for the protection Anne provided to the young princes. What this whole situation reveals is that the power of an authentic maternal voice will always triumph over the cold mechanics of institutional control. Charles Spencer's decision to release the letter did not just expose a hidden alliance, it exposed the entire machinery that spent 30 years trying to bury it. And the fact that Princess Anne, the woman the media dismissed as cold and distant, was the one who held the line for 3 decades without ever seeking credit is the most damning indictment of the palace's corporate culture you could possibly imagine. The voice from the past did not just rewrite history, it forced the modern court to sit with the uncomfortable truth that the people they have been trying to manage the narrative around were never the ones in control. The keys to the story never belonged to the sovereign. They belonged to a mother who knew exactly who to trust.